Appreciate that. Well, hello everyone. Again, I'm Joan Retman, also in Area Community Relations for Era Living. And happy summer, by the way. What a great way to kick off the season. And thanks also for taking the time to spend time with us this morning when you could be going out, getting a nice walk in before the weather gets too warm today. So we appreciate all of that. Thank you. So I wanted to do that in my present and past roles within this industry for the past 13 years. My job really has been primarily to serve families in terms of a guide to help them understand what retirement options for them might be a good fit. And it's really been an honor for me, I feel, to serve in this role because it really is one of the most important decisions that many people make in their lives. Yet over the years, by personally working in a variety of different settings and models, I've learned how all the terminology out there can really be quite confusing. And that many times a lot of folks that I came into contact with were on a path to making a decision based on either limited or possibly even incorrect information that they had learned about retirement communities in general. So today, even though I'm wearing a name badge for Era Living that you can probably see in the camera there, I'm actually wearing a slightly different hat. And it's one that's intended to share some insight with you based on what I personally have learned from my time working in many of the different models that we're going to discuss today. My goal is for you to be able to make the most informed decision possible at the right time for you and to hopefully avoid surprises that happen when not everything was considered that could have been during your research prior to the move-in happening. So we have a lot of information to cover, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to take a moment here just to share my screen with you, so bear with me one moment while I pull that information up. Okay, it's taking just a second, and now hopefully you should all be able to see this okay. So evaluating retirement living options. What we're going to do is go through the slides today, and because a lot of the information that is covered will generate other questions along the way, many of those will be answered for you probably as we go along. So as you think of questions, you're welcome to submit them in chat, but we'll wait until the very end to be able to address those questions. So today, our goal for what we're going to cover would be the common senior living models in general, the financial contracts that are attached to each one of those. We'll look at the pros and cons of each one too. And then we're going to get into what I feel is my favorite part of the discussion, the considerations, how to really make an informed decision and to know when it's the right time and the right place for you. Within the models that we're going to discuss, specifically, we're going to go into detail in the top 4 points: retirement communities, CCRCs, flex license, and assisted living. There is so much information that we could be talking about, which could be an entire day's worth of a workshop. So we're going to focus on those top 4 today and very lightly touch on the bottom section, which includes memory care, skilled nursing, adult family homes, co-housing, and even the village move-in. So let's go ahead and get started with the term retirement community. This is a very broad term. It's a way to think of it as an umbrella term. It really covers everything out there in the sense that it's describing everything that is age restricted. Some communities have different types of age restrictions. They might be designed for people who are 55 and older, or you might have to be 62 and older. So if you're 59, 60, you would need to wait to move into one of those communities, or 65 and older. Those are the 3 different age groups that we typically see. So what retirement community means, that term itself doesn't explain a whole lot to you other than you know for sure that there are age restrictions around it. And then there are a lot of variables that when you dig down deeper, help define what specific retirement community you're looking at. So we're going to start getting into those next. The first one that we're going to talk a little bit more about would be the ones that are defined more so as just the 55 and older. So this would be the younger demographic that these types of communities are looking to attract. So those that have 55 and older in terms of their age restrictions are ones that typically do not have any type of care services that are related to that community, but rather they have In some cases, activities that are available. Sometimes it's just simply age restrictions where you have to be 55 to live in that particular complex, but there aren't social opportunities or other amenities attached to it. If there are, such as like Providence Point would be one that a lot of folks maybe are familiar with, there might be a common area, a community center where you do have shared activities that you can participate in. A lot of times this is a first step when downsizing from maybe a larger home of 3,000 square feet, 4,000 square feet, whatever it might be, to move into a smaller setting where you do have maybe maintenance as part of it and living around others that are a similar age and interest, with the plan to possibly have another move in the future if there are some care needs that take place. So when you look at the downside to potentially a 55 and older retirement community, the first note that's listed on here, limited access to younger generations, that can sometimes apply to all retirement communities. And that's a comment that I've heard over the years where if somebody's worried about the timing, they might feel that it is because they don't want to live just around old people, are the comments that I've heard. I want to live around multiple generations. I don't want to live just around old people, what a lot of people might say. And what I might say to that is ask a few more questions about that before making assumptions that that would be the case, because sometimes retirement communities of various sorts do have partnerships with other organizations that do involve a lot of other generations coming in. Maybe it's a Girl Scouts troop that's coming in. Maybe it's partnering with local high schools or even elementary schools where you're doing programming either on a regular basis or just on occasion. But a lot of times those opportunities are available. You just need to ask some questions and express your concerns to learn about them. Of course, one of the downsides if you're moving just into a 55 and older that doesn't have care is that there is a likelihood that if you do need care services in the future that you probably would need to move to receive that care unless you choose to hire a home care agency to come into your current residence, which is what you would do if you wanted care services now before moving from your home. You would hire home care services to come in. With the 55 and older retirement community options, some of them are month-to-month rental contracts, but some of them you actually are purchasing a home within their complex. And if that's the case, if you have purchased something where you've paid a large amount up front, the downside to that might be that if there is an unexpected health issue that pops up and you are relying upon those funds to be able to pay for your care, if you're placed in a position where you need to move quickly, but your apartment or your home hasn't sold yet, that sometimes can be challenging. Fortunately, right now we have a pretty hot real estate market all around the Seattle area, so likely not too much of a concern at this moment, but things can change. They have in the past. So I had mentioned Providence Point as an example of a 55 and older community, but others might be familiar with the term SHAG, Senior Assistance Housing Group. That complex is all over around the Seattle area. You'll see quite a few different SHAG locations all around. They're growing a lot too, so new locations are popping up. Trilogy has been established for some time in the Redmond area, I think over 1,200 homes in that complex. And then Revel is a new community that opened recently just nearby in Issaquah that some of you might be familiar with too. So now let's move on and talk a little bit about, within retirement communities, what about the CCRC concept? I'm guessing that many of you have probably heard the term CCRC before if you started doing some research in retirement communities. And you might have heard me say at the very beginning that the terminology with retirement communities can be fairly confusing. This is an example of that because CCRCs have recently started to refer to themselves as life plan communities instead of the term CCRC. So if you're hearing life plan, it's really speaking to the same thing at this point. So those terms are now used somewhat interchangeably. The CCRCs typically are not 55 and older. Most of the time you'll see them with a little bit of an older demographic, meaning 62 or 65 and older would be the requirements there. And the idea behind a CCRC, or continuing care retirement community, means that you have 4 different components to living in that environment. It's usually segregated from one another. So you'll have independent living in one part of the community. Assisted living might be down the hall, on a different floor, or possibly in a different building. Same thing is true of skilled nursing and memory care. So to be a true CCRC, you'd have all 4 of those components to make up the care. Memory care was not originally part of the design for many CCRCs, and in recent years that's been added on for some of them. Maintenance, housekeeping, dining, transportation, activities, all of those things tend to be offered at a much more robust level compared to just the 55 and older design, if they would have any at all. So you're always going to see some sort of a degree of service offered in all of those categories, usually pretty robust at this point. It could be weekly housekeeping, it could be bi-weekly. They do vary a little bit from one to the next, so the details you'd want to contact each community, but you'll start to see some of those things at least offered, if not included in the rent for an extra fee. The idea behind a CCRC is that you would move in as an independent residence. That's the ideal move-in for someone in a CCRC. You move in while you're independent, and then in the future, if you need a higher level of care, like assisted living or any of the others, that you would have priority access to that compared to anybody living from the outside who might be needing to move directly into assisted living. You get priority as an independent resident there. Some communities are designed a little differently than others, where they might have a relatively small healthcare component. So the number of assisted living apartments, the number of memory care or skilled nursing might be small relative to the number of independent apartments, meaning that they would probably choose to be closed to non-residents, to people from the outside, so that they can have space for their independent residents when they need the care in the future. And CCRCs typically are one that have what we would refer to as a buy-in or an entrance fee, meaning that you're paying a pretty large sum before you move in. You can think of it as being equal to buying another house or a condo in the greater Seattle area. They could be quite sizable, but most of the time there's a refundable component to them. It could be 80% of the funds that you have paid come back to you if you move out in the future, or to your estate. And it's typically once that apartment that you have bought into is sold to someone else or rented to someone else, then that portion comes back to you. Some of the traditional contracts are amortized, meaning that there isn't a refund that comes to you, but you're usually paying a smaller amount upfront at the time that you move in, compared to, say, an 80% refundable contract by contrast. So now we're going to break it down a little bit further. So we've talked about what CCRCs mean in general, or life plan communities. Now we're going to talk about 3 different kinds of those CCRCs. And here's where the terminology can get even a little bit more confusing. So we just talked about how CCRCs are also called life plan communities. So now there's this term life care that we're going to throw in the mix. It's also known as a type A contract. So we're going to talk about types A, B, and C for CCRC. The type A, or life care, is what we'll talk about first. So the first point I want to make is life care is a little different than life plan. It's one kind of a life plan community. Let's talk a little bit about how they're different, or what that means. Life care communities are the most comprehensive in the sense that all of the care levels are definitely going to be there, but there's a financial benefit that's attached to them that is different than any of the other contracts out there. And how it works, again, you move in as an independent resident, and then when you move through the continuum of care to whatever care you need in the future, typically what happens is the amount that you had been paying, your monthly rate as an independent resident, just transfers with you to whatever higher care level that you are moving to next, with maybe a small additional fee, or it might remain almost exactly the same. There are some variables out there on that, but essentially it serves kind of like a long-term care insurance policy where you're drastically protected from market rate prices. It's important to know that pre-existing conditions might disqualify someone from this, though. So much like if you were to apply for long-term care insurance, for instance, you would go through a health screening to make sure that it's a good investment on the long-term care insurance company's part. Similarly, moving into an environment like this, where this type of contract is available, you would have to be healthy enough to qualify. If you have certain pre-existing conditions like an Alzheimer's diagnosis, or sometimes other conditions like Parkinson's or MS, where care is pretty inevitable, your need for care, you may not be able to qualify for this benefit. You might have missed that window potentially. Examples of a life care type of contract is pretty simple in this area because there are only 3. Emerald Heights, which is the community that was developed first in this area, I want to say probably over 30 years ago now in Redmond, was the first one. And then Timber Ridge at Tallis in Issaquah, and Skyline, which is in First Hill neighborhood in Seattle. They opened about the same time, 10, 12 years ago. Those are the 3. There's another in Gig Harbor, but that's about it in this area right now. The life care contracts are pretty predominant over on the East Coast. They started really on the East Coast years and years ago, decades ago, so you find them everywhere there. They're not quite as common yet on the West Coast. And then there's a Type B contract. So these are similar to a life care contract in the sense that there's almost always the full continuum of care. But if you move to one of those care levels in the future, there will be some sort of limit, some expiration date on those benefits. They're the trickiest of the contracts because it can be a little hard to compare one modified to the next. You're always going to want to get the contract in advance to read it to find out what that means. So, for instance, one community might offer 60 days of a reduced rate in the assisted living, and then it goes to market rate after that, or it might be a combination of a discount on assisted living or skilled nursing or memory care. But the point is that there is some sort of an expiration date on that benefit, or it might be limited to just one care level and not more than others. So you just want to ask lots of good questions to make sure you're clear on knowing when those discounts expire and what they apply to. Mirabella would be one of the most commonly known modified contracts in this area. That also opened around the same time that Skyline did in Timber Ridge at Tallis. Park Shore, which is owned by the same group as Skyline on Lake Washington, that's been around for over 50 years and added memory care more recently to their plan. They did not have that originally, just skilled nursing and assisted living, so they're an example of one that added memory care later. They too have modified. There could be some others out there, but those are the 2 that I'm aware of in this area. And then when we look at a Type C, which is known as a fee-for-service contract, these are ones where, again, you're paying a buy-in, you're moving into the community, ideally as independent living. But when you move through the continuum of care in a Type C model, you pay the market rate. So there are no discounts that are applied in this case. You just pay the market rate. However, normally the buy-in that you're paying in typically is a little bit less than what you would pay in a Type A or a Type B in a life care or a modified contract. You pay a smaller buy-in, but then if and when you need care in the future and you move to that area where you need care, you're paying the market rate. Okay, so we made it through the description of CCRC. So now let's talk in a little bit more detail about the pros and cons of CCRCs in general. So this is going back to kind of lumping all Type A, B, and C together, pros and cons of those. One of the benefits, of course, is that a lot of people appreciate having peace of mind, knowing that if they do need higher care in the future, that it exists in the community. It may not be in the same building perhaps, but it exists under the same roof or somewhere in the campus at some point, and that they do have priority access over people from the outside. We talked a little bit already about the financial protection, that it can be kind of like having a long-term care insurance policy for the type A certainly, and to a certain degree in the type B. And then some of these contracts have a benevolent fund, meaning that if you run out of your own resources at some point in the future, that these contracts are written to absorb the costs that you have in the community at that point. If that is concerning to anyone, so sometimes I would get questions such as, well, gosh, if the community is paying for everyone, then how do they have enough money to run the business essentially? If other people are running out of money, how can they afford to do that? And what I want to share with you is that this is something that's very easy for CCRCs to offer. It's a pretty safe thing for them to offer because there is a financial qualification before you move in. You do have a review of your assets to make sure that you have plenty from their analysis of the life expectancies and such, that you have plenty of assets in order to be comfortable during your time there, with also the understanding that you don't gift that money away. So you don't move in today and then tomorrow gift all of the money to your grandchildren and then suddenly you're out of money. There are rules around that to keep the companies very solid and very safe. Plus, remember, a lot of these have a pretty sizable buy-in. So with that refundable portion that would go back to someone, if for some reason their finances have become such that they need assistance, they would then draw down upon that refund too before paying for those funds. So it's a pretty safe thing for communities to be able to offer that. One of the other benefits of a CCRC is by paying that large amount upfront, that usually does mean that you also pay a smaller monthly fee as well, compared to month-to-month contracts, which we're going to talk about shortly. Looking at some of the downsides of a CCRC type of model, and some of these points in here really come from firsthand experience that I had when I started in this industry about 13 years ago. I was part of a CCRC team, and it was one that was under construction at the time. A lot of people were moving in, very excited about what their future would look like the idea that if care was needed in the future, they had a place to go, but they weren't moving in thinking, I'm going to move there tomorrow. It was maybe in the future if I need it. So while I was there, fast forward 5 years later, a lot of people had aged, and a lot of people did start to need assisted living services at that point. Remember, with a CCRC, the idea is that you move then from that independent apartment to assisted living or whatever care that you need. But when it came down to actually making the move from that, beautiful 1,400 plus square foot apartment with the amazing view that they had originally bought into, to, let's say, the 500 square foot assisted living apartment that felt very different to them, it was very hard for them to do and feel comfortable for that, for many people, that they struggled with that. Also, if you're part of a couple, that can be challenging if one person needs care and the other person doesn't. That was challenging in the sense that a lot of times couples didn't want to make the split, so to speak, where the independent person would remain in that independent apartment and the person needing support to move to assisted living and have that separation happen. That was challenging for a number of people too. This next point about the availability and having a guarantee for it. When a lot of people move into a community like this in a CCRC, they feel that they've been guaranteed that if something changes with their health, that they have a guarantee that they will be admitted into their assisted living or whatever care level in the future. And although that is fully the intent of the community to do so, there still is an assessment process that needs to happen. And although I feel it's rare that a retirement community would say that someone is not the right fit for their assisted living or memory care, I put this point on here. I think it's worth talking about because I did see it happen once where a couple had moved in and the gentleman had progressed with his memory loss, but had some kind of unique behavioral challenges around it, where when the assessment happened, that community did not feel that they were the right setting for this gentleman to move into their memory care, which meant he had to move to a different community completely while the wife remained there on the independent side of the community. And that was pretty distressing for the family. They were assuming that they would be able to stay in the same campus at least. So it's just an important thing, I think, to be aware of, that although it's rare, it could happen. When you move to a different location within the CCRC, a different apartment, that might also mean a different dining room that you would then have access to, different activities, different staff, sometimes different residents too. So there is the segregation. Remember, by design, that is the way that it is designed. So it sometimes can be difficult for people who've been living on the independent side and they've become quite accustomed to their routines and spaces there to move to another part of the community, which sometimes feels like an entirely different community because everything they would have different access to. The segregation is sometimes blended, but a lot of times it is very segregated with the types of services and amenities that they are available to. Sometimes folks will bring up a concern about the large entrance fee that's paid in, that those are funds that could have otherwise been invested for a different purpose. That, again, just a personal decision for each person to make. The retirement communities do not place that in an account that earns interest, where when you get your entrance fee back that you gain interest along with that, but rather those communities are taking that entrance fee and they're putting it to work for them. That's the purpose of it, is to pay down part of the investment if it's a brand new community, or putting it to work in different ways so they receive the benefit of that interest, but rather you receive, say, 80% of specifically what you've paid. Interest is not tied to that at all. The timing piece, I don't think this is so much to worry about in this market, again, because we have such a hot real estate market in this area right now. But again, some people are concerned that if they are thinking about moving in the future, that their kids might be relocating to Florida, and you, as a parent, might want to follow them, that your buy-in apartment would need to be resold in order to get the funds back. Again, in this area, I'm not too concerned about that, but in other parts of the country, the timing of that could mean that it might be some time before you would receive those funds to come back to you after it's been resold. And then again, we talked about the pre-existing conditions piece already, that's can be tough for a lot of people if they've been waiting to move until they've started to need some care services that they might have missed the admission window for, especially the type A type of model. So now that we've talked quite a bit about CCRCs, we're going to switch gears here for just a minute and talk a little bit about a flex license model, which many of these are on a month-to-month contract as opposed to buy-ins. So what a flex license means, or floating license is another term, is that within a retirement community, there are a certain number of apartments that can be licensed for assisted living at a given time. It can be mix and match. So it's not a segregated community at this point. It's one community where someone would move in, maybe is independent, maybe needing some care services, but you can choose from really any apartment in the community. And then if your health changes in the future, maybe you started as independent and now you need help with dressing or bathing or medication management, you actually stay in that same apartment when care is needed in the future. So you're not moving to a different part of the community for assisted living services, for example. Again, many of these are month-to-month contracts with what's called a community fee. So there still is usually some degree of upfront cost, but it's usually pretty nominal, especially compared to the entrance fee or buy-in type of model. So that might mean it might be closer to maybe 1 month's rent or maybe 2 months' rent. Some are definitely more. Some of the newer communities that are being developed right now might ask for larger community fees, but but traditionally it's usually about 1 or 2 months rent for the upfront cost, which is called a community fee. There still would be some admission requirements to a certain degree, so you may not have to be completely independent, or you may not have to worry about certain pre-existing conditions ruling you out, so to speak. But there is a certain degree of independence that you still need to be in order to move into many of the flex license type of communities out there. Most of these communities that have this model typically do have a higher percentage of independent residents compared to assisted living residents, like Era Living, for instance, who owns University House Issaquah, and 7 other communities in the area are part of this. Kind of a fun fact, actually, Era Living, in conjunction with their work with the University of Washington School of Nursing in particular, developed this model, the flex license model, decades ago. And since then, many other companies have then also recognized the value in that model and have replicated it. So Merrill Gardens communities, Leisure Care are now pretty much the same with that design, with the flex license type of concept. And with all of these companies, just generally speaking, usually you see about 70% of the residents independent, about 30% assisted. Of course, that changes from time to time, but that's generally what you see. When we look at the benefits of a flex license model, one we touched on already, a lot of people really appreciate not having to move when care is needed in the future. You can move in as independent, and when you need help with showering or medications or whatnot, you can stay in that same apartment. That's become really important to a lot of people. This creates a very inclusive culture because that also means you still go to the same dining room, the same activities, and you probably wouldn't necessarily know in communities that are designed like this who's using assisted living and who's not, because you're all sharing the same spaces that you always have been. There's not the segregation as we had talked about with the CCRCs. There is that lower upfront cost too. So for those who are a little worried about paying a buy-in and having the majority of their assets tied up, the benefit of a month-to-month model, along with a small community fee, is that you do have those funds available to work for you in a way of your choosing. The downside with a flex model is that just the opposite of a CCRC, where I said that you pay a large amount of money and then that drops your monthly fees. With a flex model or the month-to-month contracts, you have the smaller buy-in but the higher monthly fees, so it's just the opposite. Also, there are typically different types of care options that are available in most flex license or floating license communities, where if you move in to your independent apartment and you start to have care services that are needed in the future, sometimes the limitations might be that they will be able to provide care from their own staffing through one-person assistance. Some of the other models, like a CCRC that might have skilled nursing available, can do 2-person transfers or Hoyer lifts. There's a lot more that we could talk about to clarify that a little bit more, but that would take up another couple hours to go too much deeper than that. So the point to just try to remember with this one is that with the CCRC and the full continuum of care, it does mean that you would have to move again, but there might be more care capabilities around what might be available to you by having skilled nursing there. Whereas in the floating license model, there might be lighter care services that could potentially be offered to you. There are exceptions to that, so always ask to clarify that information and sometimes ways to work around that as well. But generally, that's one consideration to remember. And typically, there's also no benevolent fund in month-to-month contracts because, again, you don't pay that large entrance fee. That's kind of the protection, the nest egg to tap into if for some reason someone would run out of funds. So there typically isn't a benevolent fund that's offered in this type of model. Okay, moving on to assisted living. So assisted living, we've been talking a little bit about already, that this is commonly paired with independent living, or you might find communities that are assisted living and memory care together. or part of the CCRC, or it can be all by itself, but usually it's paired with something else. If you're not familiar with assisted living, you're going to hear terms, especially if you have a long-term care insurance policy, you're going to see language in there that says ADLs, which means activities of daily living, like help with grooming to various degrees, dressing, bathing, and so on. And most of this assistance is provided by CNAs or certified nursing assistants. Sometimes a lot of folks assume that it's an actual nurse that does the majority of the hands-on type of care, and they provide largely the oversight of that and some of the more complex components to care, but it's usually nursing assistants that do the majority of the care services in a community. For that reason, when you're looking at communities, you're going to see that the staffing might be different than you had expected. You might think that, well, nurses must be in the building every single day, all day. Because they have more of an administrative or supervisory role, in many cases, it's really the CNAs that are there 24 hours a day. That's primarily what you would want to look for. And some of them have been trained to do medication administration too. So they would be expected to be there 24 hours a day too. But nurses aren't necessarily there for that many hours unless it's a type of community that's offering a very high level of care. It's more common that you see nurses in assisted living during daytime hours, 5 to 7 days a week, more typically, and then usually on call in the evenings. One thing I want to mention, I'll make a point about this because sometimes what I had seen is that someone might tour a retirement community, just pick one that has assisted living, and then they would go and tour another, but they wouldn't ask very many questions of that second community that they've toured because they assumed that everything that they had learned about assisted living from the first community applies to the second. And that's not necessarily true. What I want to say about that is that there can be quite a range of differences with assisted living. When you are a community and you're licensed to provide assisted living services, you as a company need to make a decision of the range of services that I can offer as a provider. What do I want my model to look like? So just because you can offer potentially almost a full continuum of care in assisted living, a lot of communities kind of scale that back a little bit. So assisted living in one community could be different than another. It's possible that two-person transfers and Hoyer lifts could exist in one community, but not in another. It depends on how that model is designed, what level of independence that they're looking for. So just please remember that part and be sure to ask when you're comparing assisted living to assisted living, which community is offering what, especially if you have pre-existing conditions where that might be important to you. And we've already talked a little bit about community fees. So what I'll share with you would be some examples of some communities that are automatically fully licensed for assisted living. So instead of using a flex license, they've already licensed every single apartment in their whole community as assisted living because that's their focus. They're not really focusing at all on independent living. They're really looking for providing care for those that already have usually a fair amount of needs. So the communities that are listed here at the bottom of this slide, Sunrise, Aegis, Patriots, Glen, are examples of a few companies, a few communities also in this area that really kind of bypass the independent living part, and they just look at focusing on assisted living, usually at a very high level, like two-person transfers and Hoyer lifts is kind of where their expertise lies, along with memory care. So they have those two components paired together. Okay, so I had mentioned that we're going to touch on a few other options, but very lightly, so that we have time to go into considerations and the other components and spend a little bit of time on that for the remaining time we have left. So with memory care, we talked a little bit about that already. What I wanted to mention, in case this is helpful, is that some folks, when they have a long-term care insurance policy, aren't sure whether memory care is included in that or not because the language specifically says assisted living. When you have long-term care insurance, you can have it written for usually one of three ways or any combination of these three. Long-term care insurance policies can be written to cover skilled nursing, assisted living, or in-home care, or whatever combination of those three. Memory care is actually part of that. It's covered under the assisted living licensure. So that can be a little confusing sometimes, but to make it a little bit more confusing, technically, the type of license that assisted living is called a boarding home license. And that covers assisted living communities, adult family homes, and memory care, technically. So a boarding home license covers all of that. Skilled nursing, which is also a couple points down here, is a different type of environment that these days is more commonly used for rehab purposes. And part of that is because adult family homes exist, and a lot of retirement communities have assisted living that has expanded upon their care capabilities so much that there aren't a whole lot of people that need skilled nursing anymore for long-term type of situations. It's usually for the Medicare covered therapies that you might need following a fall or pneumonia or a surgery where you need to use your Medicare benefit to cover your therapy, physical, occupational, and speech therapy. To elaborate just a little further and to offer one quick tip on skilled nursing, if you do have, let's say, a surgery coming up, and you know it's an extensive one that's going to require some therapy, one of the things you want to make sure that you understand is what your coverage days looks like. So when you move into a skilled nursing environment temporarily for that coverage, first you need to be in a hospital at least 3 midnights to qualify and have a skillable need. Then you can go into a skilled nursing environment where your coverage for Medicare will cover you for 100% for the first 20 days. And then it stops once you reach day 100. So from day 21 to 100, it usually covers at 80%. And then if you have supplemental insurance, it can cover the balance of the two. But it's going to stop at the 100 days, or it will stop if you stop showing progress anywhere along the way up until that point. So some people assume I've got 100 days of coverage. I know I'm going to be there for that amount of time. Not necessarily. As long as you're showing progress to show to Medicare that you are showing you can still benefit from the therapy services, then you can continue on. But most people do not utilize their full coverage for 100 days. I just wanted to share that one important point there. Kind of to back up a second into adult family homes. So if you're not familiar with adult family homes, they're like houses in the neighborhood. You might not even know that you're driving by an adult family home. It looks like any other type of house. And they can house up to 6 people per household, no more than that. That's the maximum that one can be licensed for. But they're oftentimes utilized when someone needs a very heavy level of care, like 2-person transfers potentially, or sometimes for people who have progressed dementia and they're not a good fit for a community environment, that smaller, quieter spaces might be better for some folks like that. That's where adult family homes oftentimes come in. Many times they're owned and operated by nurses these days, so they're capable of doing a very heavy level of care. They're not known for their life enrichment programs, activities, or dining programs, but they focus on very heavy care. The last 2 points that I want to mention on here, which sometimes people have heard of these terms, sometimes this is foreign to them. So I'll let you do a lot of the investigating here on your own. But to talk a little bit about co-housing, for instance, this is relatively new in this area. This would be new developments that are popping up around that might be blended age groups, or it might be age specific, but the development is designed specifically for the purpose of having shared resources where you might have a kind of like a community center, perhaps, where you all agree, okay, I'm going to cook dinner once a month along with this group of people, or we have one shared lawnmower that all of us use, but it's also the design components too. So for some communities that are meant to help keep people connected as we age, some of these developments are designed so that instead of, when you think of a traditional neighborhood with a street between the houses, take the streets out, for instance, pull the houses together so there's just a sidewalk between the two. The garage might be down the street where all all of the cars are, mailboxes and such. So it by literally pulling the houses closer together with front porches all facing each other, it promotes interaction. It makes it kind of inevitable that you're going to be bumping into your neighbors a little bit more often. So you have your own separate houses, but it's designed to stay connected with other people. If you go to cohousing.org, you can learn a lot more about some of the new development in this area and what that might look like. And then there's the village movement, which actually started in 2002 in Boston, so many, many years ago. This is to look at supporting seniors in the neighborhoods that have existed all along. And the idea here is to look at pooling together individuals, volunteers, to create resources that you can share for social opportunities, transportation and such, usually not medical components involved in there, but it's a way to help keep people connected as well. So usually there's different membership opportunities that are available. The one that would be closest to you here around the Issaquah area would be Eastside Neighbors Network. Nest, that's written on this slide, is an example of the first one that came to this area, which is over in Seattle in the Greenwood neighborhood. But Eastside Neighbors Network, if you want to do a little research and search them online, you'll learn a little bit more that way. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the top 10 most overlooked considerations. And we're going to go through these one at a time. A couple of things that I'll spend a little bit more time on than others because we've already addressed it, like the pre-existing conditions. That one I do want to make one more point about, though, because a lot of people might say when they come in and meet with one of us is that I'm not feeling ready yet. And when you might ask in return, what do you think ready might look like for you? A lot of times people will respond and say, I want to wait until I can't take care of myself anymore, or until I need to be carried out of my house because I can't maintain myself or my house anymore. And a lot of people might have made that decision before knowing that a lot of retirement communities out there do have admission criteria where you can't move into any community at any time. So if nothing else, please remember this very first point, which is that most communities have some degree of pre-existing conditions, especially the ones that have independent living as part of it. So you want to learn about what that is to make sure that you understand what that might look like in terms of taking your chances and missing that admission window or not. And Carly and the team at Issaquah will be happy to talk more with you individually about what that looks like in their lovely community also. The second point, local owners and managers, I think is kind of an important one to pay attention to as there's so much new development that's happening around this area. I know during the past decade plus that I've been in the industry, I've seen a lot of shifting that's happened with this, even for communities that have been around for a while, but then they've sold to other owners who've hired different management companies. And when you have different owners and different managers, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's a reason to ask more questions to find out how that may have changed the services, the experience of the residents there. Sometimes the changes have happened and it's meant a lot of turnover for the staff. So my advice would be this: if you are looking into a community and you learn that there are two different things, the owner and managers are not the same people, ask more questions about what's the history of that over the past 5 to 10 years, depending on how long the community's been around, to find out how many times those changes have happened, how many different managers they've used. And if you're hearing that it's happened, especially more than once, that would be a pretty big red flag if it's happened more than once in 5 years, in my opinion. But if that's the case, then what I would do as part of the decision-making process is, if you like that community, definitely try to spend time with residents who've lived there for different periods of time. You want to meet the ones that have lived there along the way and have kind of experienced that journey to see, has this company been able to sustain some healthy service levels, or has that suffered along the way? And that might play a role in your decision making if you're learning about instability, or at least giving you an opportunity to ask more questions to find out how that's being corrected for the future. With for-profit and not-for-profit, There are a lot of checklists that you can print out online that tell you here are all the questions you should ask when you interview a retirement community. And oftentimes this is on there. But as part of that checklist, it doesn't necessarily tell you what that means, what the answer means. If they answer for profit, is that good or bad? Or not for profit, is that good or bad? What I would say to that is I put this on this list because it seems to pop up on a lot of other people's lists. But my advice would be if the other things are checking the boxes for you, that it's a great community and you come across that it's a for-profit and you're feeling like, well, I really thought I should only focus on not-for-profit, look at everything else first and make sure that the residents are happy, that the services are what you want, that it's within a budget that you can sustain. Look into what the annual rent increases might look like, and if all of it seems affordable, I would recommend probably dropping that one to a lower part of your list in terms of the priority of things to consider, because, you know, speaking from personal experience, when I looked for services for my parents who live in Minnesota, my feeling is that I did choose to hire a company that isn't the least expensive, for instance, but they're providing the best possible services I can imagine for my mom. And for me, that's what's most important, not worrying that it happens to be a for-profit company. So for that reason, that's why I'm making that suggestion. The next point on state surveys. I want to mention this because a lot of people don't even know state surveys exist. And what that is referring to is the Department of Social and Health Services, who governs all the licensure in all of the retirement communities in the state of Washington, do annual inspections every 12 to 18 months. They visit all of the licensed communities and take a look and see how they're doing with their record keeping, with the condition of the building, temperature checks of their water to make sure that it's compliant, all kinds of things. It's a very detailed analysis to see how the community is performing, and then they produce a report. So especially if you're seeing some variables in the answer, or into number 2 up here, local owners and managers, and you're seeing a lot of shifting around with the differences there, looking at state surveys might be really important to see how does those changes translate into the care that's being provided for those who need care in the community. Are they still doing a good job and hitting the marks there, or has that turnover resulted in overlooking some important things as it relates to care? So state surveys can give you some really good clues also. With staff ratios and longevity, this is another one that pops up on a lot of these checklists that I mentioned that you can find online. Ask staff to resident ratio and ask how long the staff have been there. There are a couple of important things to consider that these lists don't typically explain. And one of them is that the staff ratios might sound good or bad, but if you don't know how that relates to what the needs are in the community, then those numbers don't mean anything. So for instance, if you're a community that offers memory care, and you learn that the staff to resident ratio, the care team members to the resident ratio is 1 to 6, that sounds pretty good. But if that would be an answer for the assisted living side, that might give you a clue that the assisted living is really heavy in terms of the needs that are there. That's very unusual. That might be more like a 1 to 13 or a 1 to 20. And it also depends on the shift per the day too. Nighttime staff don't need to be staffed as heavily as during the day. So those numbers don't mean as much until you learn more about what the model is like and what would be good staffing for that type of model. So maybe another way to ask this question would be, how do your staff to resident ratios compare to similar communities of yours that have a model like yours? Or how do you create your staff to resident ratios? And hopefully you'll get an answer that is something like, it depends on the needs of our residents at the time. So with all of the care plans that are created, that should tell that company, okay, we now have a number of people that need shower assistance in the morning, so we're going to add on another team member or 2 to help serve that purpose in the morning, as opposed to we use a strict 1 to 12 ratio no matter what. That would be concerning to me. I would want to hear language about how it's customized a little bit more based on the needs of the residents. And with the longevity part of it, you generally speaking, yes, the longer that employees have worked in the community, that can be a clue that it's a good company, that the employees are happy. But also pay attention to that while you're touring communities. See how the staff make eye contact with you or interact with you. Are they smiling? Are they engaging? Do they seem happy? That can give you some good clues, which might even be more important than the number of years that are worked there, especially if that particular company might have these great relationships with, say, nursing schools, where they have more turnover on the CNA side of things, the nursing staff, but it might be because these are excellent students that are on a path to becoming nurses or doctors or other things, and so they're partnering with the community to be able to learn and grow and do amazing work during their time that's in the community. That would be someone that I would want, as opposed to someone who maybe isn't so happy with their job, but it's been a job that they've had forever and they've been there for 12 years and they don't look happy in the building. There are two different ways to look at it, so that's important. Number 6, the age of the community or the company. This one is important in the sense that, as I mentioned, there's a lot of growth that's happening in this area right now, a lot of new developments going on. And it's important, I think, to consider that sometimes there are companies that have been around for a while, but they're opening a lot of new communities. Just know that if they're opening a new community, usually what they do is they pull in some of their more seasoned staff, but they're hiring a lot of new people too. They have to constantly hire and train new employees. So it's good to ask more questions to try to understand how are they really preparing as they're about to open with their staffing? How are they making sure that it's all coming together? Because with my experience having done this for a while and being part of teams where opening brand new communities was part of what I've done for a few new communities, it's never a well-oiled machine at day one. There's always little kinks and things that need to be worked out, or a leaky pipe that pops up, that inspections missed or something. So it's good to kind of understand how the community has planned for all of those things and how they're planning to ramp up with their staffing based on the number of reservations that have come in and such. Size of company can be important too. My personal preference is to lean a little bit towards smaller companies than some of the more global, the larger ones, where they have more of a cookie cutter approach. So it's not to say that the larger companies are doing anything wrong, but if you're looking for a community that is looking for a little bit more autonomy in terms of how they create their activities programs or their dining programs, typically smaller is a little bit better because they're typically given permission to customize their approach and have a little bit more autonomy. So maybe asking some questions like, how does your community's dining menus compare to some of the other communities in out of state, or sister communities might be a good way to figure that out and see how much they're willing to customize the community based on the residents that are there versus having the residents fit into the schedules that exist for the company as a whole. So hopefully that makes sense. Next point about family or outsiders providing care. Some communities are pretty strict about if there's any care needs that are identified before someone moves in, that the company makes it mandatory that they do all of it. And then there are other communities that have some flexibility, which can be important for some families when they're making a decision because of how it can translate into the overall financial picture too. And one example of that might be if, let's say you're an adult child who's been helping your parent with their medications by going over to their house and setting up medication in the pill boxes every couple of weeks. And from there, the system works smoothly, and there are no issues with that. That type of arrangement can continue when moving into some retirement communities, where others might say, nope, if that person isn't able to manage 100% of the pieces on their own, then that community has to do it. So whether or not that's important to you, that might be a question that you would want to layer in there when you're looking at other communities. Ease of terminating contract if your situation changes. So this is speaking to buy-ins versus month-to-month contracts specifically. If you are thinking that it's possible, you might want to live in a community for a shorter period of time, 6 months, a year, maybe even 2 years, but then it's likely you might need to relocate again for whatever reason. Maybe it's to be closer to family and you know that family is going to be moving. That might be what you would want to factor into looking at a retirement community, possibly to stay away from a buy-in if you're worried about needing those funds for the apartment to be resold, for you to have those funds when you make your next move. And then there's this last point, which I think is a pretty important one to spend a minute on, the moving more than once piece. So it's really common when meeting with a lot of people that they say, well, I just want to make sure I don't ever have to move again. That's my biggest priority. I don't want to have to move again. So will your community guarantee that that will be the case? And the first point I want to make about that is that there really isn't any community that can 100% guarantee that under any situation you would be able to stay under the roof, whether it's in that apartment or through the continuum of care. They can't say that with 100% certainty for some of the reasons that I discussed earlier. It depends on the medical assessment. Now, in a CCRC with the full continuum of care, they might be able to make it more likely to offer that because of the continuum of care, although it would require moving to those spaces. Now, remember towards the beginning when I was talking a little bit about CCRCs and my experience having moved people in to independent living and then watching them struggle when it was time to move to assisted living or to memory care or skilled nursing. They were struggling with the fact that they had to relocate to a different apartment. They had to move. They still had to move internally, and it was hard for them, especially because it meant different amenities and a dining facility. So it felt like a totally different community to them. Perhaps that's not much different than looking at a different type of model, like a floating license, where there might be fewer care capabilities that are offered there, which means that, yes, you might have to potentially move to a higher care level at some point in the future. But my advice would be this. If you're comparing the two, a CCRC versus a month-to-month, and if you weren't thinking about the possibility of maybe having to move in the future, but everything else seemed like the month-to-month was exceptionally a great fit. You love the food, you love the residents, you love everything about it, you love the apartment, the layout, the neighborhood, and maybe the CCRC is falling short on some of those, but it's only the promise of having future care on site that's holding you there. I would just ask to give it more thought, because I've seen some people make the decisions based on this fact, having all the care, but they weren't happy with the time that they were in there. So compare what quality of life could mean to you for the time that you're in the community compared to the what if that might happen in the future and if you would ever really even need that. Both would require moves anyway. And if you're in the Seattle area and you're paying attention to all the growth around you, there are a lot of communities around to choose from. And if you love this one community, but it doesn't offer the full continuum of care, I can guarantee one thing, which is that community is going to have some really great partnerships or relationships with other communities that specialize in the part that's what's missing, and it's going to be pretty close by. So if it doesn't have skilled nursing or it doesn't have memory care, with almost a stone's throw these days, there are surrounding ones that do. And they would be more than happy to help connect you with those services if a move is needed in the future. So I wanted to just make that point that for some people, absolutely, the CCRC route with that full continuum care is going to be the perfect fit. But if it's not feeling so good, just please think about those differences or what's similar. You'd have to move again either way. So that's my point there. Enough on that point. Let's move on to a few other considerations, and then we're going to wrap it up with the consideration for timing and such. So quickly to touch on these, we talked a little bit about long-term care insurance. So we can share more details with you about how that process works, essentially that they're looking for assistance needed with 2 or more activities of daily living is typical. And that should really apply in pretty much all retirement communities that offer assisted living, but we can always share more details with you around that. If you need Medicaid, there are fewer communities around that offer that. Most do private pay only. But there are a couple of Medicaid communities around, which again, if you speak to either Savannah or Carly at University of Issaquah, if that's something that you need, they can help point you in the right direction to get resources to you to be able to pursue learning more about that. We talked about annual rent increases already. You want to factor that in the Seattle area as a whole. Most are between 3 and 6% that you would want to expect or plan on for annual rent increases. Some of the brand new communities that can sometimes be more, especially in the first several years, because they're brand new. Lots of construction, lots of expense, and they usually need to have higher rates to increase as they're moving along for the first few years. There are also other industry professionals that sometimes come into retirement communities that are contracted or just allowed to have space to come into that community. They've been vetted and can offer services there that might be covered by Medicare, like podiatry is a good example of that. Other communities like Era Living actually is a good example. Employee social workers is actually one of the only communities that I'm aware of that has independent living and assisted living that employs social workers. Normally that's only skilled nursing environments. So that's a unique characteristic that stands out, for instance. Incentives, I put this on here because this is something that you're going to see some more of lately. With COVID this past year, it's been harder on independent focused communities because COVID made a lot of people nervous about when do I move, how do I move, what's going to happen in the next year. There was a lot of uncertainty. And so you'll start to see that in part because of COVID, in part because there's so much new construction happening right now, where you're going to see various deals and things that are popping out there. And I just want to mention that if you're seeing things like multiple months worth of rent for free or locking in annual increases for a number of years, those are the types of incentives that would actually make me a little bit nervous personally, having worked in this industry for a while and understanding a little bit about how the budgets are created and how important it can be for pricing to be structured a certain way. A lot of communities can do a little something here and there. That's not surprising, but if you're seeing something that stands out that's really over the top compared to other communities, I would probably just ask a few more questions about that to learn, if you can, a little more about how that might affect their financial picture down the road to make sure they can sustain that and not have it affect cutting service levels or staffing at some point. So sometimes when things sound too good to be true, sometimes they are. So it's just good to ask more questions about that piece of it. We already talked about that last point already. So just real quickly, the last couple slides that we'll touch on is how to understand if a community is the right fit for you personally. And then the next slide will be about timing. So I think it's just really important to kind of do some self-reflection and understand where you are with health conditions, pre-existing conditions, and recognize that if it looks like you might need some care in the near future, or you've already had quite a few health conditions, it might make sense to start looking into communities that have an assisted living focus, or at least have it as part of it, as opposed to maybe a 55 and older that doesn't have the ability to support those things very well. You should attend activities if you can. And, you know, we're going to start to see that being available again. Carly had mentioned this is the last webinar for University House Issaquah, that there are going to be some events offered on site soon. That's wonderful because that gives you a chance to have more hands-on experience. That should really give you some good insight into what the feel of the community is like. It's very important to spend time on site if you can. Learn about those care limitations. So if you do have, you know, Parkinson's, MS, you have mild cognitive impairment or some other dementia diagnosis, you really need to look deeper into that community to find out how they might be able to support you, not just now, maybe while you're still independent, or what that might look like down the road. And then, of course, if you're looking at the CCRCs, whether it's a type A, B, or C, be sure to tour the whole entire community before you make a decision, not just the independent side. because if you tour the whole thing and you feel comfortable with it and you truly understand that if I need to move from independent living to assisted living in the future and all of that looks good and feels good to you, that might be an indication that it's the right fit. Other people that I worked with when I was part of a CCRC would sometimes tour the independent part and say, I don't really need to see anything else. I'm just glad to know it's there in the future if I need it. And for people who chose that path, I feel like they maybe had the hardest time transitioning to a higher care level in the future because they just really didn't think it would ever happen to them. So please tour all of those levels before making a decision. And then in terms of if this is the right time for you or not, as part of that self-reflection, take a look at how things have been going. You know, the past 5 years, what that has looked like. Even this past year, what has isolation from COVID done in terms of your mental health and awareness of that? How often are you socializing with people? Now, this past year was really hard. To think about what that might look like if something like that happens again. What type of environment would you want to look at? If eating healthy has been important to you in the past, but now you've recently been just living off of microwave foods, that could be a clue that it's time to maybe make a move. Or if you've been a caregiver for a spouse and you're feeling like that has become your primary identity as opposed to the spousal role. And definitely, if you have that diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, I would recommend getting moved sooner rather than later, because the longer you wait, the more likely it is that memory loss will continue to grow over time. That makes it that much harder to make the transition. Doing it when you're more independent is much, much easier than when you're pairing that with a lot of health issues. So my last slide is this, and then we'll open it up to any questions for the time left. That my advice would be that if you're experiencing any of these things on this slide, to strongly considering going deeper into exploring all of your options and potentially moving, feeling lonely, that lack of socialization. There was a seminar that I went to years ago that I'll never forget, and it was one that was put on by someone who was a professor emeritus from the School of Social Work through the University of Washington, who shared that the research that she had conducted was comparing seniors who had a very limited social experience on a day-to-day basis and also had stress in their lives, whether it was due to strained relationships with family or maybe some health issues that were starting to pop up. Pairing those together was the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day in terms of the toll that it was taking on one's health. So the socialization piece is not to be taken lightly. Don't only think about the benefits of moving from do I need someone to help me put my TED socks on in the morning or not, or help with medications, but also think about, please think about your mental health and your emotional health as well. Another reason to think about moving soon would be if you're a caregiver for another person and that you really feel that it would be beneficial to both of you to go back to being a primary role of the spouse and handing off some of those care capabilities. If you need help with activities of daily living now, but you're not really interested in bringing home care into your house because it feels like someone's in your space all the time, that you really don't have the privacy, moving to a retirement community of some sort can help with that, because the care services come into your apartment, your private space, provide the service, and then leave. So you don't have someone hanging around the house for a window of time, whether they're providing direct assistance or not. If you do have a diagnosis that I mentioned that does point towards inevitable care needs in the future, I would highly recommend getting ahead of it as soon as possible, not waiting. As if the thought of moving feels overwhelming to you right now, think about what that might look like if you're really having trouble walking more than 10 feet at a time, you're out of breath, or you feel dizzy, or other issues that pop up. Moving is so much harder at that point. So to try to get ahead of it is ideal. So get your crystal balls out and try to figure out the right timing on that. Good luck. Mine's never worked very well, but you might have better success with that. And then if you're having trouble keeping up with maintenance of your home, or managing all of that is starting to get excessive, that might be the right time. If you're just someone who really feels good about having a plan and taking care of all of the what ifs. What if I have a fall in the middle of night and no one's around? What if I have trouble getting to a store because we have snowfall that blocks me into my house for a week? Anything related to that can sometimes be very anxiety provoking. So if you'd like to have a plan where you have those things covered, where someone's in the community 24 hours a day to help watch out for you in that sense, that might be the right time to think about moving. So the last couple questions on this slide then would be, if you feel like gaining peace of mind by having a plan in place would feel really good to you, that might be the answer for the timing, as well as if you have family. Many times adult children do feel like a move is a gift to them to make the choice. While it's your choice, you can pick the place that you like. That takes that off their plate, and to have that plan in place feels really good to everyone. So I'm going to stop right there and see if there are any questions at all, and then ask for Carly to join back in to also maybe answer any questions, or to see what questions she can direct towards me. I'm going to stop share here while we do that. Here we go.
Thank you, Joan. Folks, if you have any questions, you can feel free to either type it into the chat, or we'll wait just a moment, and you're also welcome to just take yourself off of mute and ask the question to Joan over video.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. I'd just like to say thank you. It was a very helpful webinar. I'm sorry that I have to leave. I didn't know how to send that on the chat, but I have a meeting that I have to run, so I have to leave now. Thank you so much. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Joan, I have a question while we're waiting for anybody, if they have questions in the middle of typing. You mentioned the importance of visiting communities in person, and just going to events in person, that idea of seeing the different types of care and feeling whether or not that is something that is the right fit for you. Do you have any tips for things for people to think about, when they're just walking into a community for the first time? You mentioned, taking a look at how staff are interacting with other people. Any other things that people should keep an eye out for or think about when they're experiencing a community in person?
That's a really great question, yes. And I think one thing that's important to share too is that it oftentimes takes more than one visit to make a decision about a community. So you're probably not going to be able to accomplish and see every single part of it during one particular visit, but interacting with the staff is definitely part of it. But to go a little deeper than that, if you know that you really love food, for instance, that's an important part of the decision, which is pretty common because that's something that we need to do every single day. We need to go to the dining room or have our meals delivered or whatever it might be every single day. So not only having an opportunity to try a meal, but when it's appropriate, when restrictions lift enough to have meal with another resident would be something I would highly recommend. That can be planned in advance so that the team can find someone that might be of similar interest to you, who might really understand your perspective and your questions and be able to address that, because they too might have come from a similar situation and can help address your questions or concerns, especially with downsizing. That's a big one too. So to be able to meet with people who can give advice on how they went through it. The benefit that you have is that you've got all these great mentors that have done all of this before you, who have been through all of this before, and your situation feels very unique and personal to you, but there are so many others that I can promise have collectively probably shared very similar types of situations. So by being very honest and transparent and sharing exactly what your concerns and questions are to the community relations team member that you're working with, they would be able to then help you understand if the community is the right fit or not. So don't be afraid to be very transparent with them as part of the process. So see it in person, see the community in person, have meals, come at different times of day maybe. And when the communities are functioning like normal again, and when guests can have meals right alongside with the residents inside the dining room, it's kind of nice to be able to tour at a dinner time hour, for instance, where you can see the majority of the residents. That's the most popular meal of the day. So to tour there, maybe in addition to a daytime tour where you're seeing apartments and you're trying to get a feel for the life in the community. So again, the best way for a community relations team member to help you is just to share anything that you can think of that you know are concerns, but also allow for them to be your guide too, to help maybe uncover some concerns maybe you didn't even know are concerns of yours also. So let them kind of guide you through the process and help you think of questions to ask too.
That's great. Thank you, Joan. Does anybody else have a question?
Well, I have a comment. Joan, it was an amazing presentation. There was so much there to digest and think about, and everything you said was worth thinking about. I think my hardest problem right now is being realistic about myself, because I started my search about 2 years ago, and I'm in a not much different place, but I am in a different place mentally and physically now than then. So the things you have said really resonated with me, and it's going to cause me to really get into this more in detail about facing reality, that I might really be an old person someday and all that, and what that means to people. But you just went into so much helpful detail that it's going to be easier for me now to face reality. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you for sharing that. That means a lot. And that actually makes me think of one other quick point to kind of elaborate on, which is, planning for this move. It is one of the most important moves that I think most people make, but I think, and you can tell me if this might be part of your perspective or for anyone else who's on the call, my question, which you don't need to necessarily respond to me, but my question is, how many people are worried about feeling like, well, this is the last move I'm ever going to make, so I don't know that I'm ready to take that step. I think by thinking of it that way, sometimes that perspective gets in the way of the move happening, which can increase the quality of your life and allow you to really thrive, because you're thinking of this as, oh gosh, I'm kind of admitting my mortality here and taking this big step, and I don't want this to be forever. Remember that communities, even the buy-in models, they're all contracts that can be terminated if needed, and month-to-month contracts are only month-to-month. So maybe just allow yourself to frame it differently in your mind and think of, this is just the next move that makes sense for me right now. Knowing that if you have to change it at some point, you can, but this is what's best for me right now. Just allow yourself to think of it a little differently. It might take a little bit of the pressure off, possibly.
Thank you, Joan.
Okay, yes.
So folks, if you have any lingering questions, you can go ahead and pop it in the chat, and I'm going to share my screen really quickly as we wrap up, just to share a little bit more information about University House Issaquah. So as the name implies, we are located in Issaquah. And if you know where the Fred Meyer and the Home Depot are, we're kind of right up the hill, just about a block up the hill behind those stores. So Joan talked a lot about, evaluating all the different types of care levels and, features in the community. So I just wanted to touch on momentarily, why do people who have moved here choose University House Issaquah? So a lot of times people come here because they are looking for that flex license that Joan talked about. So we do have the ability for people to stay in their apartment when they start needing assisted living services, you can move into one of our any size of apartments. We've got studios on up to 3-bedroom apartments. Most people who move here are independent living from the beginning. Not always, but most people are. But once you do need support with some of those activities of daily living, whether that's medications or, shower assistance, what have you, you don't have to move again. You can stay in your apartment. And as Joan mentioned, a lot of times couples are really looking for that because sometimes couples don't move here until one of them needs a little bit of support. So they don't want to have to immediately separate and one person live in the independent building and another person in the assisted living building. So also because we have some of those bigger apartments, a lot of times couples are interested in our community as well, because maybe you're downsizing from a big house in the area. A lot of people really move here for the neighborhood, either because they've had deep ties on the east side and they're familiar with Issaquah and they want to stay here. We've had a lot of people lately actually moving here from out of the area, even out of state, because their family lives somewhere on the east side and we're a really convenient location to get to, Bellevue, Redmond, even Renton. And a lot of people are moving here because they're familiar with Era Living and maybe they want an Era Living community, but they don't want to be in sort of an urban environment. Our building has been here coming up on 20 years. So we've got a lot of history in the neighborhood. We've got all of the support that comes from being an Era Living community, but we're a little bit more on the outskirts. We don't have that kind of city vibe, especially our location. One of my pictures, I'll show you the view from our community, but because we're up on the hill a little bit, you can see a lot of the mountains and you're not looking out, on another like high-rise, urban building. So those are some of the reasons that people choose us. But, as Joan mentioned, it's really important for you to come here in person and ask some of the questions about the things that are important to you. Most of the folks that we work with are planning for at some point in the future. If you're joining this webinar today, that's definitely you. Some people are wanting to move right away and kind of want to know what's going on in the community. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what's happening here. First of all, I mentioned that we've got several different sizes of apartments. This is just a quick snapshot I took of one of our 1-bedroom with alcove apartments, just so you can get a little bit of an idea of what our apartments look like. All of our apartments have a kitchen. That's usually something that's really important to people who are moving here, is that even if they're wanting a smaller size apartment like a studio, they still have the ability to do their own cooking in their apartment. So this is a pretty typical looking kitchen for us. You'll always have a stove and an oven, and although we do have our own dining room that all of our residents can come to, most folks who live here are doing some combination of cooking for themselves and eating in our dining room. This is a photo I took from our 2nd-story terrace. So this kind of gives you an idea of what you can see from the community. Just looking out at the Issaquah Alps, you can see Tiger Mountain and Squawk Mountain here. And it's a beautiful green setting. It really gives you like just a Pacific Northwest view with all of the green outside the window. So usually that's important to people. They're wanting to move to a community where they can look out, they can see something beautiful. Half of our apartments look out onto something, either this mountain view or we've got a green belt behind us, but we also have 2 courtyard gardens. And so the other half of the apartments look into one of those 2 gardens. So it's a really beautiful green space. We've had a lot going on here the last few months. I took this photo back in February. Our pool was one of the very first things to reopen. This is one thing that a lot of our residents have moved here for, is because they want to either work out in our gym, which we have, or be able to swim and go in the spa. So this is a really great spot in the community. We do have water aerobics classes that have started up again. I've gotten that question a lot lately. We also have just a wealth of activity programming going on. So part of our name, University House, means that we are connected with the University of Washington, and that partnership means a lot of different things for us in terms of the care that is available to our residents. But we also get to go a little bit deeper here at University of Issaquah with some of the programming that we provide. So we get a little bit of extra programming through OSHER, which is the Lifelong Learning Institute with the University of Washington. But also the people who move here are that's kind of what folks are looking for, is they want that the ability to continue to learn and be engaged in intellectually stimulating activities. So this is a photo I took recently. This is not an OSHER presenter, but she's actually a PhD candidate, the daughter of one of our staff members, and she came and gave a presentation on her research about coral reef preservation. So our programming is kind of curated based on the interests of the people who live here. And that's a good question to ask as well when you're looking at different communities, is what do people like to do? Because usually the staff of the community will then modify their programming based on what people want. So if the community is really big on music, which ours is here, maybe they have more live performances, or like this afternoon, we have Dr. Theodore Deacon coming to give a presentation on Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. So that just kind of gives you an example. That's the type of thing that people are interested in, and maybe why they might move to our community. This is a photo that Savannah took. We recently had high tea. So this just gives you an example of some of the treats that were there. And then I took a picture of this hat because we had just some amazing hats that people were wearing at tea. And I just wanted to note, if you take a look at the table, you'll see that there are white linens on the table. I was working with somebody recently, and that was the most important thing to him, is that we had white linens on the table. And so this is a pretty typical table setup, except for we don't usually have the fancy china, but you'll always see white linens on the table during mealtime. Again, as Joan mentioned, a great thing for you to come and experience for yourself. And then lastly, this is one of the resident run classes that we did. We have a mixture of both staff run and resident run activities. So Bridge Group is another really good example of some of the resident run programs that we have. And then this is a painting class. So this is one of our residents who was learning how to paint, and the instructor was another resident who is a professional painter. So kind of depending on what you're interested in, there's all different kinds of things going on right now. As Joan mentioned, things are getting a lot more back to normal. Although you saw on the slide with the lecture, we do have some folks coming in to give lectures and performances from outside of the community. Their current limitations with that is that those presenters need to be fully vaccinated. So as those folks become vaccinated, we're able to welcome them back into the community and continue to expand on some of the in-person activities that we're doing. So that kind of gives you a little bit of flavor of what it's like at our community. If you've not been here, I definitely encourage you to either keep an eye out for invitations for some of those in-person events that we'll be doing later this summer, or reach out and just schedule an in-person visit. We've done a ton of those lately. We're always more than happy to accommodate you, whether you want to come try the food or see what's going on for an activity, see some apartments, whatever the case may be. So please feel free to reach out. Between Savannah and myself, we're here 7 days a week, and we'd love to see you. So thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you spending the time with us this morning. And thank you again, Joan. We are so grateful for your time, especially on your birthday. And if we don't have any other questions, then I think we can go ahead and wrap it up. If any questions pop into your mind later and you'd like to connect with Joan, just feel free to reach out to us and we can make sure to get those questions to her. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.